Welcome to Lecture 5 for our Prajnaparamita course. In this one, because of my conversation with the students, I have included both the Chinese and the Sanskrit. And we're going to discuss this kind of close reading in the lecture today. This is not just a language course, so I don't expect that you have to learn all that I'm going to say today, but I want to show you a little bit of what the process has been for me and for my co-translator as we did the 8,000-line version. So I'll look forward to hearing your comments, and so let's go into this deep reading. The text says, "O world-honored one, I consider these terms are what we call vocatives. That is, it is addressed to someone. So we put the word in front, O, to indicate that it is a vocative. So as you translate, you look at that with care, because it does mark divisions which the redactors, or at least what we think were the redactors, added to the text to make it meaningful. In this case, Subhuti is speaking to the Buddha. And so he, of course, never says, "O Buddha," or Shakyamuni, or Gautama, or any of the names of the historical Buddha. He uses the epithet, world-honored one, and I translate that as a direct and literal translation of the Chinese. As you can see down below, in the Chinese, the first two characters tell us. And furthermore, let's keep going. Then the vocative, the next two characters, world and honored one. Then we come to the actual sentence. You'll see that there's a comma. The character in front of the comma is the character for time. So this says that the Sanskrit is giving us what's called a temporal locative, which we translate as when. The time when. So the Subhuti says, "O world-honored one, when, ever." And then we go to the front of the sentence. A bodhisattva practices the Prajnaparamita. Now, I did not translate Prajnaparamita into perfection of wisdom, because the Chinese didn't translate it either. They transliterated it. And so you see Panna, Polomi, these were reproducing the sound of the Sanskrit. The Chinese, just like us, had many Buddhist terms for which they had no equivalent. And so they simply maintained the Sanskrit sound in the Chinese. So when a bodhisattva practices prajnaparamita, prajna, wisdom, paramita, perfection, we often translate, the perfection of wisdom. Now here we come to a question. We can translate this as what's called an optative, should, ought, or it can also be translated as a future. You could translate this instead of, when a bodhisattva practices perfection of wisdom, they should train in this way. It could just as easily be translated, they will train in this way. This is what they will do. That's the way a bodhisattva trains. So I was torn here as to which one to put. And finally put should. They should, they ought, it's proper. But I'm still not sure that that's correct. It could be just a simple future. They should train like this. So how is it they should train? I've used so as, not to think. What I'm doing, the practice, is the thought of a bodhisattva. That's Kumarajiva's translation. So bodhisattvas shouldn't think, what's happening to me right now is I'm a bodhisattva and I am having a bodhisattva thought. They shouldn't think that way. Let's take a look at the Sanskrit. Vaidya is a Sanskrit edition of the 8,000. It's the most commonly available. On page 3. So in looking at that, number one, it's saying that, doesn't say prajnaparamita, you note that. Nor does it say bodhisattva. It says bodhicitta. And so which one is right? It's because I was translating the Sanskrit, I stuck with the thought of a bodhisattva. But if I was translating the Sanskrit, I would have to say thought of enlightenment, or producing or bringing to the fore, ought to train in thinking a thought of a bodhi, of awakening. Does it make a lot of difference? It could. It shows us that when we are working with these texts, as you're going to see today, these small differences crop up. Sometimes they're very significant, and other times it doesn't make too much difference. So when a bodhisattva practices, they should never think what I'm doing is what an awakened one or a bodhisattva does. Then in the text, you have a throwaway line. Most people pay almost no attention to it. I translate it, what is the reason for this? Why is this? How come? But it is a very important marker. It tells us that we're now going to have an explanation for the statement we have just read. And it's very important when you find this, what is the reason for this, that you finally find when does the answer to that question stop? And sometimes translators miss this. So we've come to this mark. So what's the reason for this? And then we come to a very important segment where just a few words can make enormous amounts of differences. Kumarajiva says, thought, that is, this thought that the bodhisattva is not supposed to be thinking, is not thought. Now, in the earliest translation of 179 in the Chinese, that's all it says. But in Kumarajiva and in our existing Sanskrit, they add a phrase. I say add a phrase. It would appear that later redactors wanted to explain it a bit more. Why is it that that thought is a not thought? And the way they wanted to explain it is to say it's essentially clear or lacks any characteristics. It's pure. And then you'll see the character, the last character, gu. That tells us that we have the final, this is the end of the answer to the question, why is this the case? So whenever you find that, you go back and you find out where it said and why. Okay, I'm going to tell you why. It's because. So in the Sanskrit, we can see, and because of Sandhi rule, that is where you combine words, normally it would be TAT, but when it comes against a C, the last T changes to a C. That's called Sandhi, S-A-N-D-H-I. That thought, chittam, you could translate in the Sanskrit, is achittam, no thought. And then we have the additional phrase, which was not present in the earliest Chinese. Prakriti. Prakriti is sometimes translated as nature. Pra means before. Kri is, the root is to make. So previous to its existence, prakriti. So we translate that as essential. It means from the very time when it arose, it had already been made in a certain way. It is essentially the purity, prabhasvara, and then it's a possessive. This essentialness of chitta, thought, is purity. In this case, the difference many people feel is significant, that it shows that the Buddhists had, in their own development, already begun to think about what is the nature of the mind. And some people feel that this is the beginning of what's called mind only or Tathagata Garbha kind of thinking. What is the essential nature of thought or the mind? And it's pure. It's free of characteristics. So you can see why, if people had begun to think like this, that the redactor of the Sanskrit that came with Kumarajiva to China added this extra little explanation. Why is thought, that particular kind of thought of a bodhisattva, why is that considered to be a not thought? If you stop there, as did the early text, it's just stating it as a fact. But by looking at it in the way we're looking at it, we see that it has to do with whether or not thought has some characteristics. Because you need some characteristics, you need some signs, you need something that you can look at, you can hear, you can see, you can apprehend. So this is what you get if you do this kind of really close reading. Now, I hope this isn't overwhelming you. This is what you do if you're sitting down to translate a sutra and you're trying your best to understand what was meant by the translator. I don't want to second guess Kumarajiva all the time. I don't want to think that I know more than he did just because I can look at Sanskrit, although there's some information that I have that seem to tell me something that might not be in his translation. So I've tried to stick to the Chinese. I have tried to take it seriously and to represent in this translation that you are all reading that this is what Kumarajiva said. Then Shariputra pops up. Now we begin to see that Shariputra is not so wise, he's not so knowledgeable. Shariputra asked Subhuti, Is it really the case? Is there such a thought that exists, which is a not thought? The Sanskrit says, asti, is there. Tat, that. Chittam, thought. Yat goes with tat. Tat yat. That thought. Is there such a thought? As yat. Such as a no thought thought. I'd simply translate it, which is not thought. The which is from the Sanskrit word. This is at the essence of the Prajnaparamita. We are being forced to look at it and ask ourselves the question, is there a not thought? Is there a not anything? Is that what emptiness means? So Subhuti continues and he says to Shariputra, so that thought which is a not thought, is it apprehendable? Is it observable? Is it understandable as either an is or an is not? So this thing you say of not thought, well, for pity's sakes, does it exist or not? The Chinese and the Sanskrit are very close. Whatever, ya, is the nature of no thought. Is it that this no thought, astita, is an existence, an existing thing? The ta makes it a nominal. Or is it non-existent? Well, Shariputra, of course, gets it, and he says, well, no, that's not the issue. You can't determine whether it is or it isn't. It's unanswerable in a way. So then Subhuti chides Shariputra. And he says, if the thought, which is not thought, not apprehendable, you can't know if it either exists or doesn't exist, then Shariputra, let me put it to you. Was it appropriate? Was there any sense in asking, is there thought which is not thought, which is a not thought? He's really asking a serious question now. And he's asking him to deal with his own appraisal of his question. So the Sanskrit is very close. It says that thing which is no thought, Is it existing or is it non-existing? Can I see it? Can I know it? Can I apprehend it? And therefore, is it then to ask a question, yukta, to say such an inquiry? Oh, Ayusman, Venerable Shariputra. And instead of putting this at, Subhuti said to Shariputra, the Sanskrit puts the vocative right in the middle of the sentence. It's like while he's speaking, because he's really saying, he's chiding him. So he says, so Shariputra, why in the world would you think to even ask, is thought existent? Or is that a non-thought thought? Now, we don't know who asked the question, why is it not thought? It doesn't seems perhaps that they left out Shariputra might have asked it. The redactor might have asked it. This just seems to come, we don't know from where. Then Subhuti says, he doesn't say because, I put that in brackets. He just says, it's immutable, you can't change it. It's never, you can't find or separate out a not thought. So why did they do this? For just a moment, let's turn to Buddhist logic. The Buddhists had a big battle. The big battle was, is there an Atman? That's what this really ultimately comes down to. Is there a self? Does it exist? Or is it a non-existent thing? Some of their opponents on the Indian side would make the point that if I can say there is a not thought, then I can say there must be a thought somewhere. Otherwise, how could I even speak of a not thought? So the Buddhists tried to rebut this by saying in their syllogism, taken from the Nayayikas, if you have the thesis, there is fire on a hill, that is, there is an Atman in us. And we say this, the reason, because there is smoke. The Buddhists say, as did others, if you make a point that there is a causal relationship between smoke and fire, then you must give an example. As in the kitchen, where there's smoke and there is fire. And therefore, when I see smoke up on the mountaintop, I reach the conclusion there is a fire. In other words, the Buddhists were a material logic. This material logic is different than formal logic. Formal logic is you never have to refer to any real thing. You can just be abstract. If A equals B and B equals A, then you have one thing. If you say A equals B and B equals C, then you can reach, therefore, A equals C. That's formality. It's just based on the abstract form of your argument, a valid argument, but no reference to reality. No formal logician ever wants to introduce an example of A. It's enough to have the abstract. But the Buddhists were material logicians. They said, no, we need to know wheresoever there is smoke, there is fire, and our example is the kitchen, where we observe it all the time, that these two go together. And we make our argument even stronger by a negative example in real life. If I see steam rising from a lake where there is no fire, there is no smoke, as in a pond, they say, as in a lake. The mist is not indicating fire, indicating the opposite. So, for those people in India who were trying to say, if I can say in this room right now, there is a not something, it means that somewhere there must be that thing. So, inference, which is for the Buddhist, was founded on negation. If you say, there's no jar in this place, then whatever is not perceived, say the Buddhist, is not present. Just like you look up into the sky, do you see flowers? No. You don't have an example. So when the people tried to tell the Buddhist, is there such a thing as a not thought? And if there is, then that could be used to prove that there is a thought, because not thought requires a thought in order to have any reality. But the Buddhists would not accept it, because therefore you could prove that we have an Atman, an inherent soul, because there is a not Atman in a stone. So that implies that somewhere there must be a self. So the Buddha said, if that's so, show me. Give me an example. Give me a positive example. Give me a negative example so that I can infer whether or not the thing exists or does not exist. So these few words in the opening of the sutra, is there a thought which is a not thought? And in this room, is there a not thought? And if it's a not thought, how could I possibly see it, apprehend it? And if I can't apprehend it, I don't see any way to deal with it, then is it appropriate to ask whether or not you can prove that there is thought, because there is such a thing as a not thought? It was a big issue in Buddhism. And in the Prajnaparamita, they took it on right away. Before they even talk about emptiness, they ask the question of how you can infer the existence or the non-existence of things. So thank you very much. I'll see you next time for Lecture 6.